Hi, let's continue our discussion of control systems by looking at something called block diagrams in this particular video. Now, let's say you have a DC motor, and by some means you have found out that the transfer function of your DC motor is given as shown on the screen here. Okay, so you know that and you could analyze the DC motor. But let's say you also connect some other components along with the DC motor. Let's say you have an amplifier, you have a motor driver, and probably some other components as well. So how do you analyze all these systems if you know the transfer functions of these individual systems as such? So you know the transfer function of your amplifier, you know the transfer function of your motor driver, you know the transfer function of your motor, and now how do we combine all of these? Now we can combine all of these by using what are called block diagrams. So let me give you an example. So for example, take a look at this diagram here. Now each of these systems, G11, G12, G21, and G22, are different physical systems that we have already modeled and we have found their transfer functions. And then we connect these different physical systems to make a more complicated physical system. And we say, well, I want to find out the input output relationship of this particular uh, system. And of course, you can probably not without much difficulty see what the input output relations are going to be, right? So take a look, for example, what is y1 going to be? Y1 is going to be the sum of the signal coming through this branch and the signal coming through this branch. Now, what is the signal that is going to come through this branch? So at this side, you have R1, and then it is multiplied with a transfer function G11, and that's what you get here. So let me see if I can write it down. So let me get a pen here. Okay, so what you get here is basically R1 times G11. And similarly, you can find out the value that you're going to get here, and that is going to be R2 times G12. Now, if you add R1 G11 and R2 G12, you get Y1. And similarly, you can get Y2 as well. And so basically what we have done is we have modeled, so we have a complicated system and we have broken down that complicated system into small physical systems. And then we have, for each physical system, we have found out the transfer functions. And then we connect them and put them together as shown in this diagram. And then we can relate the input of that complicated system with the output of that complicated system. Okay, so that is what is called, so we have drawn a block diagram and we have reduced the block diagram to get the transfer function of that block diagram. Now to go from the block diagram to the overall transfer function of the system, you might have to do many kinds of transformations, and some of the transformations that you may want to do are shown in this slide and the next. So for example, if there are two blocks, one after the other, you can combine these two blocks and make it one block. The transfer function of this block and this block would just get multiplied, and the combined block would have a transfer function of G1 times G2. Okay, and similarly there are other rules that uh, you could just take a look at. Here are some other rules, and many of the rules are basically uh, dealing with pick-off points. Pick-off points is where a signal is being taken to some other place, right? So so you have a signal x1 here, and this is taken off to some other point here, or it is about the summing point where you're bringing two signals and adding them up, how to move it from before this after this transfer function to before this transfer function, and so on. So you can take a look at that. So let's take an example of the transfer function, of the transfer function that is shown on the screen here. And what we will do is we'll try to find out the overall transfer function of the system. right? So you have a block diagram here, you have a controller, actuator, process, and sensor, and we know the transfer function of each of these individual blocks. So what is the overall transfer function of the system going to be? Let's take a look at that.